on a tiny coral island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, between virgin white beaches, thick green foliage, and a crystal blue lagoon, was something completely unexpected. Locals call it the Tomb. From a distance, it looks like an alien spacecraft, downed in paradise. But on closer inspection, it's a vast concrete dome, half buried in sand, entangled in vines. There's no fence to keep people out, no sign explaining what it is, just a single set of numbers carved into its summit, 1979. Nothing indicates that this bizarre structure, in fact, conceals a nuclear disaster with Chernobyl-like radiation levels. Yet this was no accident, and it's set to get drastically worse. In the summer of 1945, the United States ended World War II by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Weapons more devastatingly powerful than anything humanity had ever seen. Within months, the race to build something even bigger had already begun. The problem was where to test them. Nuclear weapons demanded remote locations, vast exclusion zones, far from population centers, far from the press, far from scrutiny. The Nevada desert worked for smaller devices, such as those used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it would be far too risky to test more potent bombs on the American mainland. They soon settled on a new nuclear test site, the Marshall Islands, a chain of 29 low-lying coral atolls scattered across 750,000 square miles of the Central Pacific, roughly halfway between Australia and Hawaii. They were well clear of major shipping lanes and already under U.S. military control since American forces seized them from Japan in 1944. The local population was small, and as far as Washington was concerned, the United States answered to no one there. In early 1946, U.S. Navy Commodore Ben Wyatt landed on Bikini Atoll, near the Marshall Islands' northwestern edge, and explained to its 167 inhabitants that they would need to be moved from their homes temporarily, saying it was for the good of mankind. Within weeks, the Bikini Islanders were loaded onto Navy vessels and relocated to Rungarik Atoll, 125 miles away. On July 1st, testing began with Operation Crossroads. For the first test, 95 warships were assembled in Bikini Lagoon as target vessels, with live animals chained to the decks. A plutonium implosion nuclear bomb was dropped from a B-29 bomber, sinking 5 ships. On July 24th, the second test was carried out. This time with a bomb detonated 90 feet underwater. The explosion threw 2 million tons of radioactive water into the sky, and when it came back down, it painted every ship in the lagoon with contamination that couldn't be removed. Sailors with mops and brushes spent weeks trying to scrub the hulls clean. Nothing worked. Most of the fleet was eventually scuttled. Chemist Glenn Seaborg, the longest-serving chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, later called the test, quote, the world's first nuclear disaster. The U.S. had learned something important. Nuclear weapons left a mess that didn't go away. A lesson, it turned out, they would keep having to relearn. In July 1947, a year after Operation Crossroads, the United States convinced the United Nations to formally designate the Marshall Islands as a U.S.-administered strategic trust territory. The UN's approval came with the condition that Washington must, quote, protect the inhabitants against the loss of their lands and resources. 5 days after signing this agreement, the Atomic Energy Commission established the Pacific Proving Grounds, opening the door for extensive American weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. 1948's Operation Sandstone saw the detonation of 3 more advanced atomic bombs on Enuitak Atoll. But the following year, the U.S. nuclear program would take on new urgency. In August 1949, the Soviet Union revealed that it had detonated its first atomic weapon, years ahead of U.S. predictions. To stay one step ahead, the Americans doubled down on developing something even more powerful: the hydrogen bomb. By November 1952, it was ready. The device, codenamed Ivy Mike, was detonated above Enuitak Atoll with a yield of 10.4 megatons, more than 800 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The blast was so violent, it vaporized the entire island of Alugulab, leaving nothing but open water and a crater on the ocean floor. The Soviets tested their own hydrogen bomb less than a year later, and so the logic of the arms race asserted itself again. Bigger, faster, more. US weapon designers pushed for an even larger device, a deployable thermonuclear bomb that could be carried and dropped by aircraft. They got one. On March 1st, 1954, it was detonated above Bikini Atoll under the codename Castle Bravo. Its designers predicted a yield of around 6 megatons. They were wrong by a factor of nearly 3. Castle Bravo released 15 megatons, still the largest nuclear weapon the US has ever detonated. The fireball was nearly 5 miles wide. The mushroom cloud punched into the stratosphere and spread over 7,000 square miles. The fallout drifted far beyond any predicted exclusion zone, blanketing inhabited atolls hundreds of miles away. On Rongelap Atoll, 100 miles to the east, a 7-year-old girl named Nerje Joseph woke that morning to an impossible sight. 2 suns rising. First the usual one, climbing in the east. Then another, blazing orange on the western horizon, turning pink, then fading. Hours later, a fine white powder began falling from the sky like snow. The children of Rongelap played in it. It was radioactive fallout. The US government waited 2 days to evacuate them. By then, islanders were vomiting, their hair falling out in clumps, their skin burned and blistering. They were the first casualties of America's biggest bomb, and they hadn't even known it was coming. The US Atomic Energy Commission quickly established a medical monitoring program for the exposed populations, designated Project 4.1. Officially, its purpose was to provide care. In practice, it was also something else, a research program studying the effects of nuclear fallout on human beings. The subjects were never told. AEC official Merrill Eisenbud, addressing a 1956 committee meeting, explained the opportunity plainly, quote, "Data of this type has never been available. While it is true that these people do not live the way that Westerners do, civilized people, it's nonetheless also true that they are more like us than the mice." Nevertheless, by 1958, international pressure to end atmospheric nuclear testing was mounting. The Soviet Union had proposed a moratorium. Negotiations were underway. US scientists, aware that a ban could come at any time, raced to squeeze in as many tests as possible before the window closed. Between April 28th and August 18th of that year, the US detonated 35 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands in just 112 days. More detonations than the total of all prior US nuclear tests in the Pacific combined. 9 of those bombs fell on a single island, Runit. The first came on May 6th. An 18-kiloton device was detonated on a platform at the island's northern tip as part of a test codenamed Cactus. The blast gouged a crater 350 feet wide into the coral bedrock. Fallout peaked at 440 roentgens per hour directly above the blast site, a dose that would be lethal to a human being within minutes. Over the following months, bombs with names like Butternut, Holly, and Magnolia were fired from barges just a few thousand feet off Runit's coast. Everything went smoothly, until August 6th, when a device codenamed Quince misfired and sprayed plutonium fuel across the island's surface. The Defense Department and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which was sponsoring the test, faced a problem. They had one more bomb to detonate, codenamed Fig, and it was scheduled for the same site 12 days later, so they sent soldiers in to clean it up. With bulldozers and earth-moving equipment, US troops pushed the plutonium-contaminated soil into debris piles and shoved them into the lagoon. Then, to prepare for the Fig test, 130 tons of soil were shipped 5,300 miles from an atomic test site in Nevada and packed into a conical plug at Ground Zero, burying yet more radioactive material into Runit's surface before detonating another bomb on top of it. Fig was fired on August 18th. Radiation levels at the blast site hit 10,000 roentgens per hour, 30 minutes after detonation. The testing program then ended. The moratorium negotiations had succeeded, and atmospheric testing was over. The military packed up and left. Behind them, Ruined Island was one of the most contaminated sites on Earth, and nobody had told the Marshallese exactly what had been done to it. For the next 14 years, the people of Inuiatak stayed away from their home atoll, not by choice, but because the US military still controlled it and was still using it. After the nuclear detonations ended, the Marshall Islands became a testing ground for other types of weapons. US forces shot ballistic missiles at Inuiatak from California. They detonated large conventional bombs on the lagoon. And in 1968, they conducted a series of classified experiments that the Marshallese would not learn about for decades. Biological weapons tests, in which clouds of aerosolized bacteria, engineered to incapacitate and eliminate enemy troops, were sprayed across the atoll. According to military documents, a single weapon could cover an area twice the size of Los Angeles and produce a 30% casualty rate. The records of those tests remain classified to this day. In 1972, the US military finally invited the leaders of Inuiatak back for their first visit since 1946. According to a Department of Energy report, they, quote, were deeply gratified to be able to visit their ancestral homeland, but they were mortified by what they saw. The islands were completely stripped bare. Photos from the visit show an apocalyptic landscape, windswept, deforested, scoured, crumbling concrete bunkers, warped tarmac roads, abandoned military equipment rusting in the heat, and across the surface of multiple islands, invisible but everywhere, were considerable quantities of plutonium, strontium, cesium, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes with half-lives stretching thousands of years into the future. Despite the condition in which they found the atoll, the people of Inuiatak decided they wanted to return permanently. They were likely unaware that elsewhere, the long-term consequences of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands were becoming painfully clear. In the years following the 1954 Castle Bravo testing on Rongelap, miscarriages had doubled among exposed women from the atoll. Children were developing thyroid cancers at alarming rates. By 1974, 20 years after the blast, nearly a third of all those exposed had developed tumors. Of the 19 children who'd been under 10 years old on Rongelap the day Castle Bravo detonated, one had passed away as a result of leukemia, while 17 had developed thyroid disorders, including Nezha Joseph, the girl who had seen 2 suns rise. Yet that left the US government with a difficult decision: what to do with the radioactive waste that blanketed the islands. In February 1975, senior Defense Nuclear Agency officials sat down to agree on a way forward. The cheapest option would have been simply dumping it into the ocean, but that was prohibited by international treaties. Transporting the waste back to the US mainland was deemed too expensive. Meanwhile, a full decontamination of the atoll, the only solution that would actually make it safe, was something Congress flatly refused to fund. So instead, the Americans decided they would scrape up what they could, dump it somewhere on the atoll itself, and seal it under a concrete dome. The site chosen for the dome was the crater created by the 1958 cactus detonation, located near Runit's northern tip. But by 1975, that crater wasn't just a convenient hole in the ground. It was already a problem. The coral bedrock beneath it was porous, and for 17 years, the radioactive material left behind by the nuclear tests had been slowly seeping into it, leaching into the groundwater and the surrounding lagoon. This alarming fact was not lost on the American officials. According to a 1981 military document chronicling the meeting, many of those present, quote, seemed to realize that radioactive material was leaking out of the crater even then, and would continue to do so. To prevent making the situation worse, they decided to line the bottom of the crater with concrete before adding any more waste, creating a sealed containment vessel. However, someone later decided the lining was too expensive. It was dropped. Instead, from 1977 to 1980, 4,000 US servicemen spent 3 years scraping contaminated topsoil from 6 islands across the atoll, mixing it with radioactive debris, and pouring the resulting slurry directly into the unlined crater, straight into the already leaking coral. The material they collected included plutonium-239, with a half-life of 24,000 years, along with cesium-137, strontium-90, and the remnants of decades of weapons tests. Enough waste to fill 35 Olympic swimming pools was poured into a hole that everyone involved knew was not sealed. Even then, it represented just 0.8% of the total radioactive waste left in the atoll. The rest remained where it was, in the soil, the sediment, and the water. During the cleanup, 6 men lost their lives. Hundreds more would later develop cancers and radiation-related illnesses. Many didn't even know what they'd been working on. Bob Rettmeyer was an electrician who completed 2 tours of duty at the dome in 1977 and 78, working in just combat boots, shorts, and a hat. He didn't find out the truth until he read about it in a newspaper decades later. He said, quote, "They treat us like mushrooms. They feed us crap and keep us in the dark." The dome was sealed with 358 interlocking concrete panels, each just 18 inches thick. When the last panel was laid, the job was declared complete. Almost immediately, winter tides washed more than 120 cubic yards of radioactive debris back onto Runit shores. American authorities built a small emergency antechamber next to the dome to hold it. More debris washed up. They built a second antechamber. Then they went back to the U.S. The World Health Organization later confirmed that the structure had been designed not as a permanent solution, but as a temporary fix, a placeholder, until a proper decontamination plan could be devised. No such plan was ever devised. In 1980, after 33 years in exile, the people of Inuitak were finally allowed to return, to find that only 3 of the atoll's 40 islands had been cleaned up. The northern islands, including Enjebi, where half the population had traditionally lived, remained too contaminated for habitation. The Marshallese moved back to what was available, and made do. The only message the Americans left at the dome was the year of construction, carved into the concrete at the summit. No radiation warning, no hazard symbol, not even a fence. Locals soon came up with their own ominous-sounding name for the dome: the Tomb. At the 1975 meeting that gave rise to the Runit Dome project, Lieutenant General Warren D. Johnson of the U.S. Air Force had stated that if the structure were to fail at any point, it would be, quote, the responsibility of the United States. However, in 1983, the U.S. and the Marshall Islands signed the Compact of Free Association, a sweeping legal agreement that granted the islands formal independence while maintaining close economic and military ties with Washington. Buried within it was a provision that, in the U.S. government's view, wiped the slate clean, settling every nuclear-related claim against Washington, past, present, and future. In exchange for a one-time payment, the Marshall Islands released the United States from any further liability. What the Marshallese negotiators didn't know, because the U.S. didn't tell them, was that the dome they were effectively signing away their rights to was already leaking. They didn't know that 130 tons of soil had been shipped from a nuclear test site in Nevada and buried en Runit before the Fig detonation in 1958. They didn't know about the biological weapons tests that had been conducted across their atoll in 1968. And they didn't know that U.S. officials had stood in a meeting in 1975 and acknowledged the dome would never be fully contained, and had built it anyway. The compact became effective in 1986. Responsibility for the Runit Dome was formally transferred to the Marshallese, one of the world's smallest populations and one of its lowest GDP countries. The U.S. responsibility promised by Lieutenant General Johnson in 1975 was irrelevant, and Washington had a signed document confirming it. One ray of hope for the Marshallese was that the compact would establish a nuclear claims tribunal to adjudicate compensation for those affected by the testing program, though it was clear that it would take years to reach a verdict. When cancer-stricken Marshallese islanders awaited news of compensation, they continued to receive U.S.-funded medical care. Yet in 1998, even that was withdrawn, leaving them to suffer the painful consequences of American nuclear testing on their own. Just 3 years later, when the Nuclear Claims Tribunal finally delivered the verdict that the United States owed the Marshall Islands $2.3 billion in damages, Congress simply refused to fund it, and the Supreme Court declined to compel them. In the end, the total amount actually paid out was just $4 million, roughly 0.17% of the money owed. This lack of support has exacerbated the Marshallese national health crisis. In 2024, the UN Human Rights Council found that the island had some of the highest cancer rates in the world. The nuclear legacy, it concluded, remained a lived reality for the local population, cascading through generations in thyroid cancers, miscarriages, and what some Marshallese call jellyfish babies, infants born with translucent skin and no bones. Meanwhile, despite growing awareness of the hazards it poses, the runic dome has been left just as it was upon its completion nearly half a century ago. There's still nothing to keep people out of the site or warn them of its dangers. Inhabitants of other nearby islands frequently cross to Runit to search for copper cables and pieces of scrap metal to sell, unaware that digging in the dirt and breathing in the dust exposes them to radiation doses hundreds of thousands of times higher than swimming in the lagoon. Even more worryingly, the dome itself is now badly showing its age. Trapezoidal sections of the concrete cap have cracked and split. Chunks of concrete have broken away from its sides. Vines and foliage snake up its flanks. At its base, pools of brown brackish water collect, where the Pacific now regularly washes in, sucking radioactive water through the porous coral beneath the dome and flushing it back out into the lagoon with every tide. The U.S. Department of Energy's own point man on the Marshall Islands, Lawrence Livermore researcher Terry Hamilton, has acknowledged this issue, admitting that the dome's physical integrity is, quote, vulnerable to leakage and the sustained impacts of storm surge and sea level rise. While he's publicly stated that this is nothing to worry about, other scientists are less optimistic. Stanford marine scientist Stephen Palumbi, who visited the site, said, quote, of course it's going to break. What else can you expect? You can't just build something like that and walk away from it and expect it to stay there. You wouldn't do that with your patio. It seems the dome breaking is a question of when, not if. The scale of contamination across the atoll is already difficult to overstate. A 2019 study by Columbia University scientists found that radiation levels in parts of Inuitak rival those recorded near Chernobyl and Fukushima, sites that the world regards as the definitive benchmarks of nuclear catastrophe. Yet there's one particularly worrying factor that's making the problem more urgent with each passing year. The Marshall Islands sit, on average, just 6 feet above sea level. Since 1993, the seas around them have been rising at nearly 3 times the global average. Climate scientists project that by the end of this century, sea levels could rise by a further 4 to 5 feet, enough to submerge vast swaths of the nation's atolls entirely. And sitting at the waterline, its base already flooding with every tide, is the tomb. The dome was never designed to withstand rising seas. A U.S. government task force flagged the risk of a catastrophic breach from a severe typhoon as far back as 1982. Just 3 years after construction was completed, the warning was noted and filed. The concrete has continued to crack. The tides have continued to rise. A breach would release plutonium, cesium, and strontium directly into the lagoon and the wider Pacific. These substances don't dilute into irrelevance. They enter the food chain, accumulating in fish, in coral, and sea cucumbers that local communities harvest and sell. Plutonium isotopes from the 1958 tests have already traveled far beyond the atoll. Scientists have detected them as far away as the Pearl River estuary in southern China. A breach would accelerate that process on a scale that's difficult to predict and impossible to reverse. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. Whatever gets out, stays out. Columbia University legal scholar Michael Gerard has put it plainly, quote, Runic Dome represents a tragic confluence of nuclear testing and climate change. It resulted from U.S. nuclear testing and the leaving behind of large quantities of plutonium. Now it's been gradually submerged as a result of sea level rise from greenhouse gas emissions by industrial countries, led by the United States. The same country that contaminated the Marshall Islands is also the world's largest historical contributor to climate change, now threatening to unleash that contamination. The Marshall Islands are facing 2 existential crises at once, and the United States is the primary author of both. The Marshallese believe it's the Americans' responsibility to deal with the dome. As Marshall Islands President Hilda Haney put it, quote, we don't want it. We didn't build it. The garbage inside is not ours. It's theirs. Yet when the Marshall Islands government has lobbied Washington for help, the answer has been consistent. The dome sits on Marshallese land, and is therefore a Marshallese problem. Inuiatuk Senator Jack Adling once asked a question that's never been adequately answered, quote, "Why Inuiatuk? Why not go to some other atoll? Or why not do it in Nevada, their own backyard?" I know why. Because they don't want the burden of having nuclear waste in their backyard. They want the nuclear waste hundreds of thousands of miles away. He paused, then added, quote, "The least they could have done is correct their mistakes."